Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Pedro Reis. Welcome to another meetup of Power BI Portugal. I will be one of your hosts. We have also Ricardo. Hello, Ricardo.
Hello, Pedro.
Nice to have you here. So we are organizers of Power BI Portugal community, and today we invite Melissa Coates to be our guest for this meetup. Hi, Melissa. Welcome to Power BI Portugal.
Hello, Melissa.
Hello, thank you very much.
All right. So we are meetup 42. We are already mid-2022. Things happen fast. News keep coming in the Power BI community. A lot of features, a lot of things coming out. But then reports get fancy. But if the users go to the report and the data is not accurate, we have a lot of problems. And sometimes this is an aspect which needs a lot of care. And reports need to be taken care in terms of that. So who better than Melissa to have here in this meetup to tell us a little bit some suggestions about it? Ricardo, what can we tell our audience about Melissa to introduce her?
Okay, so Melissa Coates basically doesn't need any presentation. She's a data architect, a technical trainer, and a consultant. She has a company, Coates Data Strategies, where she's a consultant and produces also contents on Power BI architecture. About that, she's focused on governance, deployment, security, and administration. She's the author of Power BI Adoption Roadmap and the co-author of Planning a Power BI Enterprise Deployment White Paper. She's a Microsoft MVP since 2013. And basically, I would say that for anyone to evolve on Power BI architecture, at some point, for sure, he will pass on Melissa materials. So, Melissa, again, thanks for being here. And now I pass it to you.
Thank you very much. Right, hopefully you are seeing my screen correctly now.
Yes, we are.
Excellent. Okay. So thanks for that. We are here today to talk about kind of a broad, difficult to define topic, which is trustworthiness of content. If you'd like a copy of these slides, where you can get them is on my website, and I will pop this in the chat for you, so you can go find it on the presentations page. Here's what we have in store to talk about today. This is a pretty fast-moving, leaning into being an intermediate session. So I'm not going to define all of the individual pieces that we're talking about. So if you need me to pause and elaborate more on what do we mean about such and such, feel free to do that. At each one of these juncture points, we'll pause, check if there's any questions in the chat, things like that. So Pedro, Ricardo, if there's something in the chat where, oh, we really need to pause and clarify, go ahead and interrupt me. Otherwise, we'll have these good stops throughout the session to pause and catch up or clarify anything that we need to do.
Absolutely. We'll keep an eye for you, Melissa.
Yes.
Excellent. Ricardo already introduced me, so I can move on from there. I will just make one teensy tiny little announcement. There is some new content that we have been publishing called Power BI Implementation Planning. It's to complement the Power BI Adoption Roadmap. And we're going to be publishing a few new pieces of the implementation planning guidance next week. So we'll make some noise out on Twitter, LinkedIn, etc. So just kind of wanted to mention that. The only other thing I'll mention is if you like the kind of things that I talk about in this session, I have an online course where we go in lots more detail, and we have live workshops and Q&A sessions and all that kind of good stuff. So I'll let you check that out if you are interested in more. So what I want to do is start with just a little bit of level setting about why we care about trustworthy data. And it gets very tricky to define what do we mean by trustworthy. And a lot of times we talk about the fact that data can be managed on a centralized basis, which usually means IT or an enterprise BI team manages it start to finish, both the data pieces and the report pieces. And then you might have the opposite side where decentralized teams or your business authors manage the data and the reports end to end. And then you've got the situation in the middle, this blended approach where we tend to say this is managed self-service BI. And most of the time when we talk about this, we are saying that the data is centrally managed and the reports are managed by the business users, the self-service BI users. Here's the thing though, you can use these patterns of reusing the data, even if all of it's being managed by your decentralized team. So even though we tend to present it this way because it makes it easier to talk about, I am saying that any content author can take advantage of the kinds of techniques that we're going to talk about here, which Microsoft likes to call discipline at the core and flexibility at the edge, which just means we take more care with defining and testing the data because we want to reuse it. And then we decouple the reports so that when those need to change, they are more flexible and more fast to do so. So what do we mean by trustworthy content? This kind of depends a little bit on what you're trying to accomplish, but here's a few things that I think what it means. First is just, we have scrutinized it for data quality, right? That's the very first thing that we usually think about. Second, we've got some common definitions. We are using the same terminology. And if you are deviating from, say, common definitions, how does the consumer of a report know? Because otherwise they're going to make some assumptions and it's going to be confusing. The data or the information is traceable by lineage. And so we know, whoops, I skipped one, sorry. The responsibility, the ownership, our subject matter expert, the stewardship, we know who is taking responsibility for this data. And that's really important to know because if we don't know who produced it, we might be able to infer that it is less trustworthy, perhaps. Not always true, but sometimes. We can trace where it came from by its lineage or its data provenance. We know what was that original source. Is it an authoritative source? And how did the data change and move over time? So we'll talk a little bit more about things like lineage here shortly. One of my favorite topics, data duplication. I have that enterprise BI background of creating centralized data warehouses. So very naturally, I'm always going to want to lean towards let's not duplicate data unnecessarily. And we'll talk more about that throughout this session. Things like your data and your load processes, and I mean, even if you're just using Power Query inside of Power BI to load data in, but you are managing that well and you're securing it well. And when we can remove manual effort, that reduces risk and that improves the trustworthiness. Awareness of content. And this one might not feel like it's trustworthy, but where I'm going with this one is if existing content is out there and we are aware that a sales data set, for instance, exists, could it be what we need? Could it be that we can go ahead and reuse it? And you can see the downstream effect of that. So towards the end of this session, we're going to talk more about discoverability and why that's a really important piece of this whole puzzle. And the final one is...
We stopped seeing the screen for a second just to make sure.
You stopped seeing my screen?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So you are sharing your current image on the desk.
Okay.
Now it's appearing again.
Okay, we got it back. Thanks.
Okay, good. I ended up minimizing the camera because it was really flashing my own self in my face over here. And so I don't know why I took the sharing away. So sorry about that. The last one on this list is about clear expectations. And what are we asking all of your people to do? And by that, I mean, yeah, your self-service content authors, but I also mean the people that are consuming the data or the reports. And what does responsible data use mean? And how do we make it clear to them? And then we can also start to do things, we're not going to talk about it in this session, but things like implementing sensitivity labels, and there might be some policies that go along with that that help enforce certain policies about what you can and can't do with data, right? But a lot of that starts with communicating with your users, what you should and shouldn't do with data that is more sensitive. So lots and lots of pieces to this whole idea of being trustworthy. So where I want to start is shared data sets, and then we'll basically keep building on this as we move forward. But this is kind of the core piece of the puzzle. And if we start with a brand new Power BI author, everybody starts out when they're learning how to use Power BI Desktop with one data set and one report inside of your PBIX file. And where you evolve to very quickly is you've got multiple PBIX files, you've got multiple data sets, and in this example that I'm showing here on the screen, they're all sales oriented. And this is a natural place to start. And I'm not even saying that somebody shouldn't start out here, but if they progress past this at a very natural point, right? Sometime hopefully in their first 90 days of using Power BI Desktop, they learn there's a better way. But here's the thing. What they're probably going to realize is that, oh, I don't want to maintain multiple data sets, because in that previous page, if something needs to change, they're changing the calculation 3 times, et cetera, et cetera. So then they put everything in one PBIX file, and that gets a little out of control. It can get really wieldy if the file has 20, 30 report pages on it. The goal, where we want people to get to as they become more experienced authors, is to decouple their data and their reports. And this is just separate PBIX files. And this is not difficult to do, but it is a habit change, and it does require a little bit of training. Where we want to be is, let's say, for example, I have published this sales data set up to the Power BI service. So when I want to create a new report, instead of where we talked about a moment ago, that new report down here makes a live connection to the existing data set. And we can do that with Power BI reports. We can do that with paginated reports. It's the same thing conceptually when we're using the Analyze in Excel functionality, that sort of thing. And if you've heard people talk about a golden data set with thin reports, that's exactly the technique that we're talking about here. Now, I'm also not saying that this has to be one massive single data set. What I am saying, it should be fewer data sets. And when you do want to create a new data set, you're consciously thinking through, here's why I can't use an existing one or can't modify an existing one, and why a separate one makes sense. Advantages. This really aligns perfectly with that idea of managed self-service BI. So those 3 columns I showed at the very beginning, this absolutely lines up perfectly with that, especially if you have different people that do the data modeling and the report creation. Because you've just separated the PBIX files, they can work independently and not have to trade who's working in the PBIX file right now. Reduces your risk because we have fewer data sets. We have fewer inconsistencies between data sets. You've all seen something like profit margin being computed a little bit differently in different data sets, right? Things like that. We have reduced maintenance, which we all like, changing things in less places. So the change effort is less burdensome, which is always really good, and reduced level of data validations because, well, we only have to validate one data set or at least fewer of them. So I always like reducing risk. And that in turn says we're not eliminating our governance and our compliance concerns, but we are lessening them. This also helps usability for your report consumers because each individual report, so this one here and this one here, we can target them for individual use cases instead of saying, hey, we have 40 report pages in one PBIX. And so that's a really nice thing. And then fewer data refreshes. Hey, that's good for performance. Gives us additional security options. We're going to talk in a little while about using different workspaces for publishing our data versus our reports. And there's some huge advantages to do that. So we're going to baby step to that concept, but this supports doing that sort of thing, which is almost always about security. So hold that thought. We will get there. Now, there are reasons that we wouldn't want to do this, or at least disadvantages to be concerned with. So the first one is when we're centralizing the data, that means we have to have more processes to be careful with it. Change management needs to be a thing. So that means we have more process and we can't necessarily be as fast or as speedy when we introduce changes. So that's not desirable for every single data set. If you have a new set of reports, they're only going to live for 3 months because we're analyzing if we want to open a new location, for instance, right? We don't need to make that harder than it needs to be. So just because you say, let's use shared data sets when possible, what it doesn't mean is that we use shared data sets always, always, always. And that's where governance gets difficult because we need to say, here's our best practice, but it's also okay to deviate it when we have a good reason to. So there's rarely this one rule that fits everything across the board. Ownership and responsibility, depending on who owns what, and if you need changes to that shared data set and somebody else owns it and they're refusing to do it, that's absolutely a reason to create your own. We'll also talk about composite models here in just a few minutes. I also want to make it very clear, and you would all intuitively know this, but we want to say this out loud, is that just because you're using the golden data set doesn't mean that we don't have to test our reports. So we can still screw up the report visuals. We can still mess up those report level measures. And so it can lead to a little bit of complacency just because we started with the golden data set. So let me shift to demo mode here for a second, and let's talk about what a few things actually look like in Power BI. And then Pedro, Ricardo, you guys can let me know if there are any questions about shared data sets that we want to handle.
Okay.
Yes, Melissa.
So I'm in a workspace right now called sales data. And if I go to this particular data set and I view its lineage, one of the most important things when we're starting to say we're going to reuse data is who are we going to impact when something changes? So this quickly tells us that, oh, there's something going on in, say, 6 different workspaces that depends on this particular data set. These numbers are really low because this is just my demo environment and it just happens to be whenever I'm in here. But we can see over in a different workspace, there's a sales analytics workspace. And if we pretend that we are seeing a decent number of report viewers and number of views, we could see what would be most effective if we're making a change. Now, the other really interesting thing that's in here is this idea of notify contacts. And this would just send a message to anybody who's listed as a contact in Power BI on something that is dependent on this data set. And so you can customize this message. I think this is a good idea to do. I think it's also a very, very good idea to post it in, if you have a community site, right? Those big changes that are published somewhere where there's a history that people can see that, oh, last month there was a couple of new key measures that got introduced, things like that. Now, if I pop over to my sales analytics workspace, and we're going to talk a little later about the difference to these, but if I sort by type, there are actually no data items in here. So these are all decoupled, if you will. But if I go to one of these reports and look at its lineage, what I want to point out is that when we start from something that's already downstream, so I started from the report. And so what I'm basically doing here is I'm saying, what's the upstream lineage? So the first thing that we looked at is more like a downstream dependency or impact analysis, whereas this is more looking at upstream lineage. So two very different views depending on the point of view that you started with. Now, if we pop over to desktop for a second here, there's a couple different ways. We said that this just requires a habit change, but it's not hard to do. So I just want to point out how easy this really is to do. And if I started from Get Data, we could choose a published Power BI data set here. There is also a new menu called the Data Hub, and we're going to talk more about the Data Hub in the service here in a little bit. We could get to Power BI data sets that way too. So here, if I choose this, this is basically, they call this the Data Hub as well. So they're kind of starting to overload that terminology, but this is going to help me say, well, what's already published, what's endorsed. We're going to talk about that a little bit here. And okay, this is the one I want, and I'm going to connect. So yes, it can be a little bit of extra trouble if you're the same person and you're making changes to the data set. You got to publish it, and then you got to go to the report and you got to connect to it and maybe refresh to see those changes. But inherently, it's not difficult. So down here, we can see a little message that says we're connected live. And over here, we don't actually see a data pane. We're just seeing the reports and the relationships. Okay, so to make everything work that we just looked at, there are two tenant settings that are really important for you to make sure they're set. One of them is called Use Datasets Across Workspaces, and we'll talk more about that notion later, but you want to make sure this is enabled. Usually, I think it can be enabled for everybody in the organization because you're going to rely on the actual security of the items to control who can connect to what. So for instance, in desktop, I reached up and I did a live connection to that sales data set. That's because I have the read plus build permission on it. The other big one that's really important to do is called allow live connections. So that would allow the thing that I just showed you, plus using Analyze in Excel, which is conceptually the same thing, just over in Excel instead of desktop. This is another one where usually I think that leaving the actual tenant setting open to the entire org makes sense because you can rely on security for the individual workspaces or the individual items. But where this starts to make sense to specify certain security groups would be if you have some sort of process where you have allowed or approved report authors. And maybe there's some sort of prerequisite for them, like a certain amount of training or even a certification, right? There's a number of levels that you can go to there. So that's the only real time that I would start to reduce something like this is if you're truly managing approved report authors. Any thoughts or questions on data sets before we baby step to data flows?
Absolutely, Melissa. Just a comment. I think from your presentation, things start to make a lot of sense. So first you start with a data set plus the one PBIX, then you evolve to a model where you have a data set and have more reports. I particularly like the point where you mentioned a feature from my experience that is not so well known, which is the impact analysis and notifying the users that basically there was an update to the data set. I think that's particularly interesting and might be interesting for that was shared here in the meetup. We have a question from Gustavo. Gustavo, would you like to pose the question to Melissa?
Yeah, could be. Thank you, Pedro. So, Melissa, so would be, what's the key drivers in your opinion to indicate there's a perfect candidate for a shared data set beside of the fact of a reutilization, for example, in business process for accounts receivables, if you go specifics, accounts receivables overdue, could be one specific or less specific, for example, accounts receivables.
Perfect. I love that question. And I actually want to hold off on answering it for just a minute, because once we talk about data flows, then we are going to be able to say, should we use some of those common elements in a data flow or a data set? So let me jot this down.
Fantastic. Thank you.
And then we're going to come back and say, here's what the rule of thumb maybe should be for when should we use a shared data set versus a data flow. All right, just a heads up that we're running just a smidge behind time-wise. So we'll see if we can move along here. So what I want to do is take the concept of data reuse just a little bit further. And the idea here is I'm showing two PBIX files, and it has two data sets. And what if there is a lot of that data, the preparation actions that are in the Power Query piece, that are repeated across these multiple PBIX files? So if you have been keeping almost your personal little M script library so that you can copy and paste things between PBIX files, that's the same kind of scenario where we start to think a data flow will make sense. So let's pretend that we have these three different shared data sets, and we have separated them because we said they have enough different use cases that we truly want separate data sets. So I'm actually kind of starting to tiptoe towards the answer of what you just asked about. But they also have a lot of source data that's going to be common. That's where bringing in data flows really makes a lot of sense. So there, our reusability that we're looking for is really about, I want to reuse that data prep work, basically the Power Query pieces. So instead, we do it over in Power Query Online, and same interface as desktop, but done in the service. And then if we can pretend that there are certain tables like accounts receivable, for instance, that table can be used as a source in all three of the data sets that are shown here on the page. And same idea that we said earlier, if we have different people that create our data sets versus our data flows versus our reports, that further decoupling of where things are managed really helps this self-service BI enablement idea. It also, and this can be a big one depending on your source systems, if you get a lot of data, for instance, out of something like SAP, you do not want every self-service author in the entire organization to have to learn how to query complex source systems. So essentially what you can do is stage or pre-process that data in a data flow, shield them from the complex source system, and just reduce their effort. Where that becomes really key, and this is a big reason why I deferred to that question a couple minutes ago, is what we would think of as dimensional data. So in data warehousing speak, we have dimensions and facts. So all of these kinds of attributes that are absolutely going to be reused across a ton of different data sets in the org. Things like customer, region, product, even date. That exposing those via data flows so that your data set authors can go pick them up, that's a huge win. There's also certain subject areas that might be useful for different teams, your annual budgets, for instance. Even if you've got security mappings that are set in maybe a source system, you want to pull them in, you want to be able to do some dynamic row level security kind of stuff. So there's a variety of things you can do with data flows that are interesting. There's also the notion of data flows data is stored in Azure Data Lake behind the scenes. Whether you see it or not, it's actually there. And what you can do if you want to is connect your own data lake. That means if the data behind this data flow is something you want to go after directly, you can actually access the data. And what's good about that is it allows you to reuse the same data again in another way. We don't say that data flows take the place of a full-fledged data warehouse. No way, no how. But if you need an authoritative source for your data set authors to get to, and you don't have a data warehouse, they can really fit that use case very well. We're reducing the load on the source system. We're reducing how many people need access or permission to the source system. And all of this improves usability, right? So what you want to do is put as much as possible into the data flow to reduce what every single one of these data set authors needs to do. So friendly table names, friendly column names, data types on all those columns, removing things that aren't needed for relationships or analytical information, all that kind of stuff, as much as possible into the data flow. So I'm actually going to skip the demo to save us time for accessing the data flow from desktop. What I just showed you a minute ago for accessing a data set, same concept. The thing that I would have illustrated, though, is that you can go into the Power Query editor and you can do more work. So just because you're asking your data set creators to get data from a data flow doesn't mean that they can't do more work in order to refine it. They can still do more Power Query work. So they're not handcuffed as much as you might initially think that they are. Now, the other thing that I want to point out to make this work is there is a tenant setting to create and use data flows. This one is very interesting, though, because it's either on or off for the entire organization. This is not one where you can set for specific security groups. So before we move on to kind of go back to that question, if our goal is to have reuse of a data set, and by the way, a data set really is a semantic layer. It's got the calculations, it's got the relationships, it's set up to do all that slicing and dicing analytical information. And it's going to be useful across a number of use cases or a number of teams. That's when it's really good to start setting up this idea of a shared data set. If it's really just one team, one use case, let's not make it harder than it needs to be. And then the data flow, of course, is more about reusing data prep as opposed to reusing the semantic layer. What I want to do next is kind of go back to the data set and take another step further with composite models. But are there any questions in the chat that we need to address at this point?
Not for now, Melissa.
Yeah. I think
All
we're
right.
good for now. So we'll call back. We'll have another opportunity. So if you guys have more questions, feel free to let us know and we'll come back a little bit later.
Okay. So one of the downsides, if we say we want you to use this shared data set, that live connection means that everything you need to do your report needs to be in that source or in the data set. So the problem that that's meant to solve is this idea of moving to this mouthful called direct query for Power BI datasets and Azure Analysis Services models. And the whole idea here is that you take the report that would have started out as a live connection to down here, right? But instead, what we want to do is we want to bring in some additional data sources. So we flip the live connection to be a direct query connection. What that does is it allows us to bring in extra data sources. And that's what ends up making it a composite model. So let me elaborate on that here just a second. So technically speaking, a composite model means that we're combining multiple connection types. So if we go back over here, one connection would be our direct query to the Power BI dataset, and another connection could be import from, say, Excel, or even a data flow or something like that. So let's say we've got this organizational data set, and we're going to call that, the thing we're starting with is our remote model. And so we're flipping our live connection to the direct query. Then, by virtue of switching it to direct query inside of desktop, we now have the capability to have a local model. So in this example, our local model has imported data from, let's say, Excel. Great use case, right? That shared data set might have 98% of what we need, but we really got to have that extra thing. And so this really takes the idea of managed self-service BI and adds more flexibility to it. By the way, this pattern works for Azure Analysis Services as a remote model too. I'm just only picturing Power BI to keep it simple. So this idea of having a local model means we can do two very big things. The first one is this idea of extending that centralized data model or the shared data set that you started with. So maybe we have a new data source, or maybe we just have new measures or new hierarchies we want to create. Those would be stored in your local model. Or maybe we just want to personalize that centralized model. So maybe we want to rename some certain columns or measures, and that renaming would only be stored in the local model and not up in the original remote model, with the caveat of let's be careful not to introduce a bunch of confusion. But maybe sales returns and allowances, you just want it to be returns, and you want that to be in the local model so that all of the reports that use it don't have to over and over and over rename it on the report level. So this is all about extending, personalizing, customizing. This works really well if you've got, say, the enterprise BI team manages the original shared data set, and then you've got some departmental teams that need to extend and customize it. And so you've basically got, 3 tiers of people that do different kinds of work. And again, we want to have less duplication of effort for all of our data set authors. We also want to reduce risk, right? You've heard all of these ideas before, same thing, just taking it further. Now, there are a few downsides that we got to make sure that we know of. Querying a remote model is never going to perform as well because we're making one more hop. So we got to test it, right? I can't tell you how much slower it's going to be. You have to test it. And it's still a new feature. It's still in public preview. And there are certainly some limitations that will get lifted over time. Another big thing to know about. So it's easy for me to say, let's create a shared data set and reuse it for a whole bunch of different stuff. But in reality, when we go to start using it, you might have something unexpected happen. So for instance, there are some calculations in that original remote model that the original author basically had some dependencies, right? Maybe some context or maybe some other columns. So when you're not using that calculation in the same way down in your local model, things are just not working how you'd expect. And so a lot of that can be mitigated with good documentation. We'll talk about that at the end, but this kind of thing can happen. There's also some weird permissions requirements. So at the moment, if you are in Premium or PPU, ignore what I'm about to say, but if you're still using Pro and you've got your report viewers way down here, they would actually need the build permission on all these layers here. Normally, they would only need read on the data set, and that's all we'd want them to have, right? So the build permission is all about you have that extra permission to go build or create new data sets on top of this data set. But there's still an outstanding issue for Pro. So watch out for that. They do have it documented in Microsoft Docs. The other thing is row level security. So you can't propagate it up to the remote model. So if row level security doesn't start up here the way that you need it to work, then you might not be able to use this pattern, right? If the way it would be applied downstream doesn't fit. Then there's also this idea of, hey, we're using the golden data set. There might be these unreasonable expectations that downstream content is accurate because, as we said earlier, I'm going to say it again, just because we started from the organizational golden data set doesn't mean it can't be wrong when we get downstream. And if the issues are bad enough, it can start to reduce the perceived trustworthiness of that original model. And that can lead to things like, oh, we've got some technical debt, we've got some problems, and who's going to fix them? And I've heard one situation where the enterprise BI team that owns this starting point was being asked to go fix all of these downstream items, and they couldn't support it, right? So just be very careful with things like this. So if we go back to Power BI Desktop, and down here, we have how it says connected live to the Power BI dataset. And then there is this little message to say, make changes to this model. It is also on the modeling tab up here on the ribbon. So if I click that, what's going to happen is I'm going to add a local model, and it is being switched from live connection to a direct query connection. So it's not yet technically a composite model until I go and I add more data. So theoretically, that's all you would need to do. Oh, the other thing, let's say for this individual model that you are working on. Oh, come on, don't hang on me now. No, don't do that. If we go to the options and the settings here inside of Power BI Desktop, so let's pretend I created a data set here. And before I publish it to the Power BI service, there we go, publish dataset settings here under current file. There is a setting here to prevent users from creating direct query connections to this data set. What that means is if you don't want people to create the downstream dependencies on this data set, you would prevent it here. So this is set on an individual data set basis. And then the other thing to know about here in the tenant settings is there is this setting here, and this got released a few months after the functionality originally got released. So this is a little bit newer, and this is just fundamentally who can do direct query connections in general. So again, kind of the same rule that we said earlier for a good rule of thumb is probably you could allow the entire organization unless you've got a set of approved authors that you really want to control who's allowed to create these situations where there's the chain of dependencies. All right. Any thoughts or questions on that? I'm almost afraid to ask because we could spend gobs of time talking about it, but
No, Melissa.
okay, good. We can always
Melissa,
circle back at the
I want
end.
to highlight one sentence that you had in the presentation, which is really interesting, which was discipline at the core, flexibility in the end. I absolutely love that sentence because it illustrates the different levels of responsibility as you heighten the level of complexity of the pipeline. If it's okay, maybe you will steal this sentence and use it more broadly, because I think it's a really nice catch, this sentence.
You can absolutely do that. And that is actually on the Microsoft. Here, I'll even show you where you can find the original of it. If we go to the guidance documentation, and I think they've got it under, ooh, where is it? Oh, shoot. Okay, it's in the Power BI guidance documentation. I won't take the 30 seconds it would probably take me to find it. It's a Microsoft term, so steal away.
Awesome.
So let's talk about, we've put in some effort to create trustworthy content. We want to encourage reuse of certain things. So how do we help others know how trustworthy it is? And so that leads us into thinking about what should be certified. And we have two types of endorsements. One is certified and one is promoted. Now, certified means that the author of the content wants to tell you this is trustworthy. And guess what that means? It means you've got some responsibilities. It means that some level of rigor should have occurred. Promoted is more of just amplifying, hey, this is available or this is new. And promoted doesn't mean that it's not trustworthy, but it absolutely means something less than certified. So we'll look at this in a minute, but I want the number of people who are allowed to certify content to be fairly small. And when we're talking about governing Power BI, I'm usually leaning towards how much freedom can we give people? But I do not want to allow every single Power BI author in the entire organization to certify content, because if it's set to certify, we need to have standards. And we'll talk more about what those should be, at least as a minimum, but it should be limited. So we'll come back to that in a little bit. So we have these two kinds of endorsements, and we have them in three different buckets: data, reports, and then our set or our collection of reports and dashboards that we would put into a Power BI app. And these three distinctions are actually really important. So let me explain why they are important. And let's first start with, what do we mean by certifying data? We've got datasets, dataflows, datamarts. So if we say we're going to certify a data set, since the next level down from a data set are reports, what does that mean? That means we're targeting report authors. And that means we're saying to those report authors, you can accept a dependency on this data set and you can trust it as a source for building your own reports. So if we switch to a data flow, the next level down from a data flow is a data set. So that means we're targeting different people. We're instead targeting our data set authors and saying, you can accept this data flow as a dependency and trust it for creating your own data sets. So both of them are, trusting a data something, but since it's being used in that next step in a different way, right? The target audience is slightly different. Then if we bring in datamarts, which we haven't really talked about datamarts at all yet. If anybody wants to stay longer, I'm happy to talk about datamarts just a little bit at the end. And I've actually got a new diagram that I'm going to release soon on my website about datamarts. But there's two ways to connect to it. One of them is you're going to connect to this data set. That's basically, it's a built-in data set when you create a data mart in Power BI. And so that one really is about same thing we said before. We're going to connect to the data set. So it's the report authors that we're targeting to trust it. If we're connecting to the SQL endpoint, then we're back to targeting the data set authors. So slight bit of complication there, but really just kind of the same idea for we are certifying data, which kind of author are we targeting? If we move to report certification, so we have set one Power BI report, for instance, to be certified. Then we're saying something different. We're saying the consumers of the report. They're not taking it as a technical dependency, like everything we've said before this. Instead, we're saying you can trust this data to make business decisions. So certified data, all about helping our authors. Certified reports, we're talking more about helping the consumers of those reports. Then we've got an app certification, and we've got a collection of reports and dashboards inside of an app. And when we certify an app, it's basically this one-click convenience. But there's more to it than that, and I actually want to show you that here in a demo instead of talk about it conceptually. So let me switch over here. And we are going to start in my sales analytics workspace. And what I want to point out is I've got this report called Product Sales Analysis, and it is set to certified. And if I go to the settings for this report, here's the endorsement, here's the certified, and by the way, there's this little link for how do I get my report certified. So one thing that you can do over in the tenant settings is to set this link. In fact, let's just do that now while we're talking about it. So we said earlier that certification should be limited to the people that know what to do. And so I've got a group called the Power BI Certification SMEs, or subject matter experts, that I use. Here is where you would set this documentation page. Here in my demo site, I really just have an ugly little SharePoint page. So, all right. So that's the setting inside of a report. All right. So now notice that in this workspace, I have two reports that are certified and I have one that's promoted. And I do have an app. And notice that I have more reports that are included in the app than I have set to be certified. And you probably know exactly where I'm going with this. So if I go to this little ellipses up here at the top right, and I go to Edit App Endorsement, this will show me the property for the app itself to say, yep, the app is certified, which is fundamentally saying at the level of the collection of items, all of them that are in the app are going to be considered certified. So you can see we've got a little here. So if I were to look at, say, gross margin analysis here, running the report from the workspace level, and I drop this down up here, well, this endorsement is going to say promoted. Now, if I go over to apps and I run the app itself and I look at any single page inside the app, but we'll jump to gross margin analysis just for fun. As you would kind of expect, it's set to certified because the app as a whole is certified. So my recommendation is usually try to set the endorsements the same inside the workspace as here, so that if you do have people that are seeing it at the app level and the workspace level, it's not confusing. Even if all of your viewers are in the app, it's still nice to not have this weird little mismatch, because have you really done all of your same testing on all of these reports if they're not set to be endorsed individually? All right, we looked at the tenant setting, so perfect. All right, any questions on certifying or the endorsements before we move forward?
No, Melissa, for now.
Okay, we're getting close to the end. So here we're going to start pulling a couple more things together, because you already heard me hint at this. Separating our workspaces. So we've got this situation where we've got this data reuse happening. And let's say I have different people that need to manage this sales data set from the reports. How do I do that? And one way, of course, is if they're all in the same workspace and your authors have workspace admin member contributor. One way is the report people say, I promise I'm not going to touch the data set. No way. I'm only going to do reports. And for small teams, that's fine, right? The honor system is fine for small teams in formal situations. But when things are a little bit more broad than that, or if the content is certified and you need to make sure it's trustworthy and you need to be darn sure it's not going to change unless the proper processes are followed, you need to secure it separately. So the best way to do that is that we basically have a data workspace and then we have a report workspace. And that's going to allow us to secure them separately. Which means, let's say our data authors, plus the people that work in, say, the centralized BI team, IT, your center of excellence, right? They all might have the workspace role to say, I can edit and manage this data set and, well, anything in the workspace. Then the report authors down here, and this is intended to show that you're going to have usually a lot more report authors and a lot fewer data authors. They can have their workspace role down here to say, I can publish content to this particular workspace. And then what they would have is a read plus build permission up here on this, which is basically going to let them do the live connection, et cetera, but it's not going to give them too many permissions, and you don't have to play where on the honor system here. So this here, I haven't added datamarts yet, and I should, but this here is basically saying I have data flows in one workspace. Here's a different workspace for certain types of data sets. Here's another workspace for another data set, et cetera, et cetera. And all of this really starts to set you up for clarity on who is allowed to edit versus view the content, or really who owns and manages it. And it's very clear based on the workspace roles. And that just really helps when you have cross-team collaboration happening. So who is responsible for what, and you're not over provisioning permissions. The build permission is really the key piece of this here to help allow the people that are creating their own reports. So down here, if they only need to read, they just get read or view permissions. And if they get to create new content, they get the build on top of that. Big advantage is if you need row level security to work down here on these reports for the people that have permission to edit this content, because it's up in another workspace and they can't edit the data set itself, that means row level security works. if these had been all in one workspace and the report creators have edit permissions on the workspace, row level security is just, it's ignored. And so this is how to enforce that even for the authors in addition to the consumers. So that alone can be a massive advantage. Now, the downside is, sure, we have more workspaces to manage, monitor, navigate. We've got a new piece of content coming out as part of Power BI implementation planning guidance. I'll drop in some links at the end for you, but it's a really good, thorough conversation about how to plan for your workspace structure, all of your tenant level considerations and all of your workspace level considerations. So I'm wildly excited to come out, get that published here in the next few days. That's over on the Microsoft site. So if we take a look at a quick demo, and this will all be in the guidance that gets published here in the next few days, but you want to think about good naming conventions so that as you start to have more workspaces, you can discern what things are in what. So for instance, because data is in the name of this particular workspace, I know that the other sales related workspaces are reporting or analytical workspaces as opposed to where the source data will be. The other thing that you can do that's really interesting is use different workspace icons to indicate what kind of content is stored here. Is it data? Is it reports? So that can help people scanning. A lot of time we use those icons for either the subject area or who's responsible for owning and maintaining it. But you can do some really cool, interesting things there. All right, this is our last section. So tell you what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get this done and then we will handle any open questions that are left. So at this point, we have done a lot of stuff. We've made effort to create our trustworthy content. We've done our data validations, of course we have. And how do we convey that to our consumer population? And so one way is to make certain data sets discoverable. And this idea of discovery is I can search for and locate data sources in the organization. And the goal is I'm aware that this data exists, even if it's owned by, say, a departmental team. And so could be otherwise sort of this silo. If we set it to be discoverable because others can use it, then we can go through this standard process to request access to the information. So let me show you what this actually looks like. There is, in the Power BI service, recently renamed from the Datasets Hub, it's now called the Data Hub. And so what the idea here is, I don't like that little thing at the bottom. Windows 11 is so annoying. What we have here is basically a roundup of data sets and data marts that are shown here in the Data Hub. And so there's this All tab, and then there's also this Endorsed in Your Org tab. When they first released it, they called it Trusted in Your Org. I'm so happy that they changed this label. And so I'm going to pretend that it was my feedback. Yeah, I'm going to totally pretend that it was. No, the reason that I like this better is because something's promoted doesn't necessarily mean it's trusted. Because if you are doing what you should be doing, certified means certain things. So anyway, if I go to this particular data set and go to its settings, and I go down to this endorsement and discovery area, if it is either promoted or certified, then you can also make it discoverable. Let me show you what that looks like to somebody who doesn't have access. So I'm over here logged in as another user, scoped. So this user if I look at their Workspaces list, you can see that Griffin's list is much, much shorter. And sales data is set to be discoverable, but he does not have access to it. So you can kind of see here that it's a little bit grayed out. There's an information thing here, and there's a button to request access to work with this data. This is a nice little message that you can create. We're saying that if you want to use this data set, use the form at blah, blah, blah site, letting them know you will be asked for a business justification. The Center of Excellence will approve the request and access will be audited every 6 months, right? So that will tell the person up front some custom information about if you're going to submit your request, here's what we expect from you. And where that message was set is also in the dataset properties under this request access. So normally it would just go to the dataset owner, which is the one and only one dataset owner, which kind of makes for a responsibility for this one person. So if you want to use a form, this is the best way here, is to use this little request access button. So there are other data sets in the Data Hub that we would not set to be discoverable. So for instance, if I go back here, I've got something called executive bonus tracking. If we went into its properties, you would see that although it's highly confidential information, we would not want that to be discoverable ever. So some good, useful things that we can do here. The process to certify content at a bare minimum. And in my course, I have this massive, very long list of things that you might consider doing to certify content, right? Basically giving you the laundry list of possible things so that you can simplify and say, this is what's going to work for me. But at a bare minimum, you want to look at the sources. You want to make sure that you understand the lineage. You want to do a technical review of the data model. You want to review the reports and the visualizations, right? Just to kind of make sure that, we're not going to necessarily pick on choices of visualizations, but making sure that if we're putting out a certified report, that it is presented in a good way, meets the goals, that sort of thing. Absolutely, we need to do a security review, no question about it. And I don't mean just row-level security for the individual data set. I mean, let's go look at the workspace where we intend to publish this thing. How do we intend to share it, etc. Data accuracy validation, so testing source to data set, and a review of documentation. So let me tell you what I mean by that. Report documentation. The kinds of things that I think are useful are, what's the purpose? Who's the target audience? What key business rules or calculation logic might live in here? What are the data sources? Who to contact with questions? And when I say report documentation, you could implement this a whole different way. Could just be a simple little page in the PBIX file. That, if that does the job, go for it. Some people like to put some of this inside tooltips or bookmarks. Some people like to create a separate documentation page like a SharePoint wiki page, right? And you would link to it from an information button. So lots of different ways you could implement this, just kind of making sure that people know what it is they're looking at. And if they have questions or even suggestions or feedback or a way to report bugs, all of those sorts of things. You also might want to think about having a change log. This could just be a little page in the report or even a page in the report associated with a data set. Doesn't have to be super complex, but who did what when? Otherwise, how are you going to know for sure and be able to convey to others? Now, you might also publish your change log somewhere else. Totally fine. A data quality dashboard. So here's where thinking about, this is a certified data set or report, right? How do I know as a consumer or downstream user of that information so that the consumers can actually see, if they wanted to, this result of what you tested and how? Not necessarily something you need on absolutely everything, but on those really key pieces of certified content, absolutely very helpful. And then you want to make sure that you set all of these properties that you have. So who's the contact for the report and the workspace? Do you have a good description? Does it have a sensitivity label? Because the label can absolutely tie into here's what you can do or not do with this content. The discoverability, any custom instructions, right? All of these properties, making sure if you're going to say this thing is certified, right? This goes on your certified checklist. So lots and lots of things to do. I'll kind of skip showing you some of those in the demo unless anybody wants to specifically see it, since we're running just a little bit over our time schedule. So the last two thoughts I have for you is this is all, absolutely everything we've talked about today is sort of under that mentality of everyone's a data steward, and securing and protecting data and using it in a trustworthy way. It's part of our regular job, absolutely all of us, the consumers and the producers of information. And those of us that are admins or even producers of information, when we set up things like this and we want people to do certain things, how do we help them do that in the normal course of their work? So an example that I just showed was that little custom message of, hey, go request access here. Don't ask John for a data export so you can go do it on the side. Do your request. We will respond to it timely, right? We'll use the activity log to understand who's doing what. And, if we do see too many exports, for instance, we'll go in and figure out why so that we can get people doing things more like live connections, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so here's a link to where you can find the slides that I just went through, where you can find other stuff from me. And that's all of the pre-prepared stuff that I had, so we can handle any open questions that there might be with however much longer they will allow us to stay.
Wow, Melissa, thank you so much for this amazing presentation. It was a lot of depth that you covered and a lot of things that need really to be considered for an enterprise deployment and with different layers. So really interesting, and you covered a lot of things. So guys, if you have any questions to post, feel free to just give us a sign in the chat and we'll post them to Melissa. I will pose you a question already that I think will interest a lot of our guests too, which is specifically in the section that you presented the key advantages of data versus report workspaces. Mm-hmm. And where you mentioned, for instance, that there might be different levels of technical responsibility. Let's say the scenario we presented where you have a level 1 with corporate IT, then you have a level 2 with the departmental IT, and then you have a level 3 where the report authors are basically connecting to the level 2 datasets and building their own reports. Let's talk a little bit and combine this with DevOps. I know that this might be an entire subject for an entire presentation connecting the two things. Sure. So what I'm interested to ask you is from your experience, for instance, setting up a normal deployment pipeline is pretty simple, but if you take steps like assigning workspace to a specific new pipeline or copying or moving reports, that might not be so pleasant. In your experience, have you seen any good practice that you recommend especially for guys in the level 2 or level 3 of responsibility? Because we're pretty sure that the guys on level 1 will use the deployment pipelines or Azure DevOps or something like that. But when it comes to the level 2 or level 3, maybe do you think that they will be using any type of pipeline? Should they be advised to use it? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so first of all, to use a deployment pipeline, you do have to have premium capacity or premium per user. So there's a little bit of that gate to get through. beyond that, if it's certified content, my request would be, how are we protecting the production version of it, right? Does it have to be with a deployment pipeline? Not necessarily, but do we have a good process in place where we know who's allowed to update it and how it might be updated? So the lightest version of separating production would be, some people say, hey, the app is production and what's in the workspace is like test and what's in desktop is like development. And if that works, that's actually okay. And if this is more common for those level 2 or 3, and I'll kind of rephrase it, and I would normally call that like a departmental solution, right? So let's not make it harder than it needs to be. And if they have a process and they use it carefully, totally fine. But if they're ready to graduate to using deployment pipelines, and then we've got separation of development, test, and production, then we've got to have the processes in place for how we're going to do that, who's going to allow that. So I don't necessarily say if it's certified, we have to use a pipeline, but I think that would be a common thing in a lot of cases.
All right, absolutely. So we have a lot of comments on the presentation, and we had a lot of claps when you also mentioned the integration of the datamarts also here in the conversation too, and mentioning basically to certify the datamarts or to certify the data sets that are associated to the datamarts. So I saw a lot of reaction in towards that. So I mean, we are looking forward to see the next content that you announced that you will release too. I'm pretty sure that will be exciting to take a look upon.
Good. Yes, it's ready. I just have to finish the little roundup of the blog post. I might even record a short video to kind of walk through it. So yeah, I'm kind of excited to get that out there. It will be soon.
Absolutely. Melissa, we have no further questions for the moment. It was a pleasure.
Pedro.
Yeah, go ahead, Ricardo.
Maybe I use this time just to ask a quick question. Melissa, at some point around the half of the presentation, you are talking about Power BI thin reports. I think it's where you mentioned splitting data and splitting the report itself. Without entering into much development details, can you please explain how that works? I think I've seen some months ago some posts of Reza Rad talking about doing this split. I don't know if it's supposed, for example, to have a PBIPT where some people just work on the model and others where people work more on the report, but I would like your opinion.
So there's a couple different ways we can do this, right? So if you knew from the very beginning that you're going to do the split, then, we create the data set in the PBIX, we publish it. And then we later create the reports, et cetera, et cetera. So if they're combined, there's a couple different things we can do. There's some bloggers out there that have posted how to crack it open and decouple it after the fact if you want to take that step later. There's also, hesitate even mentioning it because it doesn't help for the report side, but a tool like Tabular Editor, if you've got multiple people that need to work on a single thing, that helps on the data set side, because underneath the covers, you can basically set a property to where instead of one file, it's a BIM or BI model file, it can store the different pieces in different files, so then different people could work on it. But the problem is that it doesn't care about the reports. Tabular Editor is all about let's focus on the model. So then you'd still have the situation of, I have reports that need to be pulled out into their own, and then you want to grab the technique for splitting them out. Did I answer your question that you were shooting for? Not entirely sure.
I am not totally sure, but maybe it's my fault because There was a time around, I think, 1 year ago, where lots of articles were appearing on the internet. I don't know if Pedro works with this, if he knows about doing this kind of split, but I think it's of course related to your comments.
Yeah, I recommend a short video from Reed Havens. It's about 4 or 5 minutes. It's the coding way of doing it, so it's a really easy way to do it, and it's pretty intuitive. I think that's really interesting, and it's really good for the process that Melissa shared, because a lot of the things depend on doing this step if you want to then decouple a little bit about the organization. So definitely, Ricardo, I think that's a very important step in the middle of this process. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Pedro.
Yeah. So there are a couple different versions out here. I have not played with it recently to know what is and isn't working anymore. But thanks, Rishi. Yeah, this is definitely one of them that I was thinking of. So.
But
Awesome.
we'll see. Anyway, in next weeks we will have new materials from you, right? On the Microsoft sites.
Yes, indeed. Let me show you where to find those. So, and I'll put a couple of links in the chat for you. So let me pull up two things very quickly. So the first one is the Power BI Adoption Roadmap, and let me actually give you the nice link, the AKA MS link. Now this is the thing that Matthew Roche and I published first. This was published last fall. And incidentally, he and I are doing a full day pre-conference session at Past Summit this fall on basically how to bring this to life in your organization. So that should be a whole lot of fun. But the idea here is, what are the big kinds of things that you want to think about to adopt Power BI? And when we say adopt, we absolutely do not just mean more report views, more usage. There's so much more to it than that. So this is one.
Melissa, you got mute for a second.
Exactly, she was muted for a moment.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a gulf between, there's a lot of product core documentation, how-to information, and then these lofty adoption roadmap types of concepts. How do we help people with more specifics about how to implement Power BI? So the first thing that has landed for implementation planning, and let me get you that nice 1, 2. The first pieces that have landed here are what we call the usage scenarios. And so if I just go to one of them, one of the 3 goals for this implementation planning documentation is to convert the older Power BI Enterprise Deployment White Paper. So it's getting pretty old now. That's the one that I wrote with Chris Webb. So these are kind of the reimagined scenario diagrams and where we started. So what you're gonna see starting as soon as maybe 2 days from now, maybe a little longer if there's any hiccups in the publishing process, you're gonna start to see more things here underneath this, whoops, I'm in the completely wrong place there, sorry, here under the implementation planning. So we've got about 20 different areas defined. And so we started with a simple one and a complex one. So the next things to land are going to be tenant setup and workspace planning. And so tenant setup is pretty short and easy, 1 pager. The workspaces one is a 3-part thing. And then right now we're also working on all of the information protection stuff. Security's coming after that. And then the pesky auditing and monitoring is coming after that. So we've got about 20 different areas. And the whole idea is every piece of it is going to end with, here's your action items, here's your checklist. And so the conversation prior to it is not going to be long, because we're just going to really say, here's why you care about this thing. Point to other resources like the core documentation. We're not trying to recreate that, right? But essentially the whole goal is this end-to-end checklist. So I'm really excited to see how people view it and what kind of feedback we get. So it'll take us the next several months to get all these 20 pieces slowly but surely land.
Okay, so it's really good to, you guys have the link in the chat. It's really great to know. So we'll keep tracking on this page for the updates. And checklists are great. So to have an entire process think through and something that is really actionable and that we can take advantage of. So thanks for sharing, Melissa. So I think it's time. Yeah,
Pedro, if you allow me, I just finished with one question to Melissa. Is that if Melissa, do you have any published book at this moment? I believe you don't have no time available for working in more different stuff like new books or new training or something like that.
Right. The two big places where I spend time these days are the stuff that we're writing for Microsoft. Okay. And then here's the link. I've got a training course where I spend quite a bit of time, and so that's my two-pronged focus right now. And so, you know, as part of the training course, I get to talk to people, well, every single week about what they're doing. So I've held back a lot in the last year on taking any consulting projects because, well, I just don't have time. So, and so I get a chance to talk to people every week about, because most weeks of the month we have either a live Q&A or a live workshop where we work through stuff. So for instance, tomorrow we're going to work through your planning for sensitivity labels. So what's that label structure look like? What are we going to do with them later in terms of label policies? So that's sort of the practical hands-on thing that we're attacking tomorrow.
Thank you.
So yes, it's great fun, but no books. Maybe someday, but.
The day only has 24 hours.
25, Pedro, 25.
Okay, so guys, before we close, I want to tell everyone I would like to thank you, Melissa, again for your participation in Power BI Meetup Portugal. We'll be glad to have you sometime from now. I'm definitely going to ask you to come back sometime soon, maybe even in person, maybe next year or something like that. We'll talk about that. Maybe
if my husband gets his way, we'll be living in Portugal ourselves a year from now. So we'll see what happens if life is. Oh yeah, he's wanted to move us there for 4 or 5 years, and there's been like 3 different major life events, and you can guess one world event that's various things have put it on hold. So yes, we'll see if that gets to happen in 2023 or not.
We were starting to prepare a big meeting before COVID, but then COVID started and everything stopped, right, Pedro?
Yeah, absolutely. We'll try to. So we are doing these events not only online, but we're doing a mix of live events. Just for everyone to know, during August we'll do a stop on the meetups. We'll not have a meetup in August. We'll be back in. We have events prepared for September, October, November, December. We'll announce it soon during the month of August. So guys, I wish everyone a nice vacation during August. Power BI Portugal will be on vacation in August, and see everyone in September.
And thank you very much. Again, Melissa.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
See you later.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Keep safe.